a lot of our data shows that it's actually the medium and higher skilled levels that are more important to firms in terms of EU migration. So you can see how any restrictions there could have a massive impact on the ability of those firms to attract the talent they need to create the products they want to sell abroad. And from our perspective, we'd like to see that be as easy as possible. And that's a really key concern, I think, for a lot of businesses.
Now, a key issue has been the freedom of movement, and this has been a key issue across the UK and no less in Wales. So the freedom of movement, the principle of freedom of movement, allows EU citizens to move throughout the UK for work. Now, the Welsh Government has been very clear that it is very important for Wales to allow at least a certain amount of freedom of movement because of the massive contributions that EU citizens make both economically and also socially within Wales. If we look at a number of public services, for example, the National Health Service, and also if we look at higher education, for example, the contributions of EU citizens is significant, and this is something that's been highlighted by the Welsh Government.
I think the best outcome for everybody would be to have a properly negotiated settlement. Again, it comes back to the confidence issue. At the moment, people don't know what's going to happen next year or the year after, and that means they put off investment decisions, they put off hiring decisions, and that can be a real concern for growth. So the last thing we'd want to see is a situation where you have a cliff edge with no deal going forward.
For Wales, the single market has a particular significance, which is the case for small nations, because small nations are able to say we can be a gateway to Europe. So you can come and invest here, and you don't solely have access to a market of, say, 3 million or 65 million. You have access to a market of 500 million.
Structure funds has managed to maintain a stable level playing field, as opposed to potentially in 2008 it would have perhaps dropped back further. So I think the Welsh Government have been very successful in lobbying it. They've demonstrated they can do it. They do very much adapt a partnership approach, although they still deliver a hard percentage of the funds themselves, but there is still that engagement, and we're part of the PMC and everything else. So I think they've been very successful over and built up since 2000. You know, they've had 17 years experience now, and they are very good at it, and we have a very good working relationship, as particularly the third sector has benefited because they actually understand that they can't deliver those sorts of projects. They'd like to, but they know they can't. So my organisation has actually spent a lot of time working with them, and we've actually developed schemes, and they've allowed those schemes to happen in order to get the money out to the sector. So we've had direct grant programmes to third sector organisations in Wales that has actually not turned around and say, I want you to deliver X, Y and Z MVQs. These are, you know the client groups, you engage with them, you work with them, but tell me what you do with them and what happens next to them. Whereas in England, you know, they've been run by government programmes. Most of the third sector organisations have been told you have to deliver X number of MVQs or X number of qualifications, and we have not actually had that. So it's been quite a refreshing view for us, and some of my colleagues in England and Scotland have been quite jealous of the approach that we've been able to take in Wales.
So the fall in the value of the pound is interesting for firms because it creates opportunities for those exporters. So it makes firms in sectors like manufacturing more competitive potentially and able to sell products in ways they haven't before. But it does pose a challenge as well for importers. So I was chatting to a stationery firm fairly recently who said they'd had to raise prices because the cost of imports have gone up quite significantly. So that really is a mixed effect. I think if we were trying to ascertain the overall impact, you'd have to look at the sectoral mix, and we know Wales is a country that in the past has had a much stronger manufacturing sector than elsewhere in the UK. However, there is a danger here in focusing on a lot of large exporters that would see a benefit for this. I think one of the problems we've had in the past is a lack of diversity in terms of exports. So if we really want to make the most of that depreciation in the pound, we need to think about how we get new small firms exporting and doing things perhaps they wouldn't have considered in the past.
So we know that the agri-food industry is particularly important within Wales, as is aviation, as is the automotive industry. So when looking at that future relationship between the UK and the European Union, the Welsh Government has to be particularly attentive to the shape of that of the Welsh economy.
Get more from the Open University. Check out the links on screen now.